Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage President and CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, Madeline Swan Tran Milka.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for day two. I am Madeline Milka, President and CEO of APAICS, so welcome bright and early again. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to our summit partners, Amazon, AT&T, Johnson & Johnson, Meta, and State Farm, and all of you for joining us today. We also are very appreciative of our panelists and special guest speakers and our moderators for guiding our discussions. If you have not yet downloaded the guidebook app, we highly encourage it so that you can read on the schedule and read more about the panelists and speakers today. It's really the work that all of us do to encourage our communities to participate in public service, and we really appreciate all that you do in making sure that you have a voice in these conversations. If you have any questions about the rest of the day, please feel free to ask any of the APAICS team members who are outside. And it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Congressman Takano. We are thrilled to have him as our first speaker of the day. He is the second vice chair of KPAC and an honorary co-chair of this year's Legislative Leadership Summit. He currently represents California's 39th congressional district and was the first openly gay person of color to be elected to Congress in 2012. He serves as the ranking member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs and as a member of the Education and Workforce Committee. Please give him a warm welcome.
Well, good morning, everyone. I am Mark Takano, representing Riverside County, the Inland Empire, California's 39th district, and second vice chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. It's a privilege to speak with you this morning at the APAICS Legislative Summit, Legislative Leadership Summit, and to celebrate AAPI Heritage Month with y'all. First and foremost, I want to thank Madeline Milke for the invitation to speak this morning and the entire APAICS organization for its tireless work increasing AA and NHPI representation and voices at all levels of the government. I just reconnected with somebody who told me that they walked precincts for me in my first election. And his kid was like, an infant at the time. He's now 10 years old, which indicates the passage of time. Just looking not at my watch, but at the calendar, just how long I've been in Congress. Summits like this one are important for elevating and discussing many of today's pressing issues affecting our community. Our experiences are unique, and AA and HPI perspectives have contributed immensely to the fabric of America, but our community has been experiencing significant hardship and immense challenges within the last 3 years, and we all in this room have some idea of what I'm talking about. Recently, I had the honor of joining KPAC Chair Judy Chu and first vice chair Grace Meng, and the esteemed Helen Zia and many other leaders and activists at the launch of the Vincent Chin Institute and reissuing the second edition of the Vincent Chin Legacy Guide. We gathered in somber recognition of the senseless murder of Vincent over 40 years ago, and I remember that very vividly, what occurred. We all know that Vincent Chin was a Chinese American about to take his wedding vows. Some Detroit auto workers in Detroit who blamed their plight on the rise of the Japanese automakers, took out their vengeance on Vincent, and tragically, there was very little justice. The two perpetrators, I don't think did hardly any jail time at all for this. And this was, I think, in federal court this all occurred. The judge, the judge gave way too much grace to the perpetrators, and it I think enraged our community that AAPI lives could be seen as cheap, and as evidenced by the very lenient sentencing. Vincent's murder to rising anti-Asian hate during the COVID-19, from Vincent's murder to the rising anti-Asian hate during the COVID-19 pandemic, it has been essential to remember that an attack on one in our community is an attack on all. And I think we all understand that we may come from many different subcultures and sub-ethnicities of what it means to be AA and HPI, but very frequently in this country, distinctions are not made between a Chinese immigrant or a Chinese American versus a Japanese American or Korean American, a Vietnamese. Our facial features drive us toward a certain fate in this country, so that when there is a sentiment that might accrue to one, a negative and hateful sentiment, it affects all of us. Our survival, our ability to thrive in this nation as threads in the fabric, is contingent upon our commitment to one another. The horror of back-to-back mass shootings during the Lunar New Year at Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay left our community with a gaping wound. On a day that was supposed to represent a time of family and renewal, many of us were weeping for the 18 victims of these atrocities as if they were our own aunties and uncles. These moments touched the lives of thousands of people who must then live with both physical and invisible wounds. As violence and hate crimes against the AA and HPI community continue to rise, we cannot keep accepting these horrific moments as routine and see them normalized, and to see these feelings of vulnerability that we felt then become normalized. Now, growing up as a Japanese American, I quickly learned to understand the unique problems that we as a community face. I learned that at a very young age. In the 1940s, my own parents and grandparents were incarcerated by the American government because they were seen as not American. In fact, they were referred to as enemy aliens. And despite being stripped of all of their physical belongings and dignity, my parents persevered. After the period of internment, my mother opened, after having a long period of time working as a secretary in the public schools, she opened a successful small business that she ran well into her retirement. I would eventually get my education at Harvard, and recounting my own personal journey is just one of the reasons why I support the race-conscious admissions process that I believe that I benefited from. I will tell you right now, I am a beneficiary of affirmative action. Today, affirmative action is currently in peril, pending a June decision expected from the extremist and unethical Supreme Court. We're bracing ourselves for, I think, some more going backward in this country. There's ample evidence that the majority of Americans support affirmative action, that these policies are integral in promoting campus diversity and closing the educational gaps. And many students from communities of color on low-income backgrounds face significant hurdles to higher education, underscoring the necessity for affirmative action policies to remain in place. As a former teacher, a public school teacher, and as now a senior member on the Education and Workforce Committee, I'm committed to combating Republican efforts to destroy our education system, and will always be a champion for pathways to the great equalizer that is higher education. AAPIs are the fastest growing demographic in the country, yet we are the group least likely to hold elected office in positions of power in both the private and public sectors. This further underscores the importance of having leaders such as Catherine Tai and Julie Su in key roles, and we are going to get Julie Su confirmed. They serve in key roles at the White House and throughout the administration, as well as organizations such as APAICS, and serve as pipelines to help us get into these positions. And by the way, I've been told that my friend Betty Yee is here today. Is Betty? Hi, Betty. There you are. I've heard rumors that Betty may try to break some glass ceilings in California. I wonder if those are true. While in these positions, we as leaders have a responsibility to ensure that our voices are heard and that our contributions to the American story are recognized. Now, as former chairman and now the ranking member of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I have worked tirelessly to protect the civil rights and well-being of AAPI service members and veterans. In this Congress, I reintroduced the Korean American Valor Act, which would provide Korean American Vietnam War veterans the recognition and health care benefits that they've earned serving alongside their American brothers and sisters. Many people might not know that 300,000 Republic of Korea service members were sent into Vietnam to fight alongside Americans. Have you talked to any Vietnam veteran about the participation of the ROC? The ROK service members, they will tell you that they were a feared and fearsome fighting force. One Vietnam vet said that the American soldiers would not dare march on this one particular road, and from afar, he would see the enemy just sort of scatter when the ROC was just sort of fearlessly marching up that road. And there are many, many stories of just the bravery and courage of the ROC. Many of them became naturalized citizens. There are about 4,000 of these naturalized Korean American former ROK members. And they suffer from PTSD. They suffer from Agent Orange exposure. Many of them are in ill health and they're in their 70s, and they really can't fly back to Korea for health care. And so they came to one of my Vietnam veteran ceremonies and said, "We are Vietnam veterans. We want to have access to the VA healthcare system, which has specialized healthcare for us." Do you know that American allied nations of World War I and World War II, we have these reciprocal agreements to take care of each other's veterans. We pay for each other's veterans. We have not done that for non-European allies, and my bill would authorize the Secretary of the VA to begin those negotiations. I think it's time that we recognize these Americans for the heroes that they are. I'm also working with my AAPI colleagues in the Senate to establish a Fred Korematsu Day of Civil Liberties to honor this civil rights icon for his role in the fight for civil liberties. I also wanted to sort of add something I think is I don't want to leave this out, but as an example of what AAPI representation means in the Congress, some of you might have known about the China Initiative, which targeted Chinese American scholars. It was initiated during the Trump administration in 2018. And it resulted in some disastrous injustices of Chinese American researchers, having their careers upended. We have today the CHIPS Act, which is considered one of the great accomplishments of the administration. But were it not for the fact that Chairwoman Judy Chu, and I were not appointed to the conference committee that reconciled the Senate version of USICA and the House version compete to that bill, there were sections of USICA that would have created China initiatives throughout the government. And that would have been a disaster for our community. Because Judy and I were in the room, and we had the backing of Nancy Pelosi, this CHIPS bill might have ended up not as a purely good thing that it is. So representation matters. Well, I want to encourage you all to use this summit to acknowledge our rich and diverse communities and cultures and the unique issues we all endure. The commitment to the membership of APAICS makes our efforts so successful, and individuals from all stretches of our nation devoting themselves to public service in all levels of government. We, the people in this room, make change happen to empower all in our community. And I want to thank everyone in attendance today whose leadership and advocacy has helped empower our community. And I see so many amazing advocates and leaders here in the public and private sectors. Together, we have made much progress, but there is still so much more work to be done. I look forward to the indivisibility we will continue to forge, and we will continue to complete the work ahead. So thank you. Have a great conference. Enjoy the day.
Thank you, Congressman Takano. I really appreciate your leadership and all the work that you do. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce our next panel. And this is the Anti-AAPI Hate and Violence Community and Policy-Based Solutions discussion. Our community has begun to change their daily routes in fear of violence and hate attacks. This panel will discuss how the community can sustainably protect itself from these attacks, along with the legal and cultural shifts that need to occur and how they intersect. We will also be discussing how our community can come together to heal and move forward. And to begin this panel, we're going to start with a fireside chat with our moderator, John Yang, and Connecticut Attorney General William Tong. John is currently the anchor of PBS News Weekend and a national correspondent for PBS NewsHour. He has covered Congress, the White House, and the Supreme Court in his 4-decade-long career. Attorney General William Tong is the 25th Attorney General of Connecticut, and he took office on January 9th of 2019 and is the first Asian American elected at the state level in Connecticut. If you don't follow his Instagram, his Tong tastings are definitely a tour of all the things that he tries when he's on the road. And good. I hope to see it on Instagram. So please join me in welcoming Attorney General William Tong and PBS News anchor John Yang.
Well, we moved some furniture. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tong, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Let me start with a little news. Being a newsman, let me start with a little news. Overnight, we learned that half of the victims in the shooting at the Outlet Mall in Dallas were of Asian descent. They are now investigating whether or not this was an anti-Asian attack. Just let me get your reaction to that.
Well, my reaction is, of course it was. It was driven by hate, and I'm the Attorney General, so I deal in legal standards. Let's just set those off to the side. We know what it is. It's an attack targeting people that look like us, and learning that almost an entire family was eliminated and destroyed, including a 3-year-old, brings back, Michelle Go and Yao Pan Ma and the women in Georgia and Half Moon Bay and Monterey Park and Newtown for me. And how many people have seen Who Killed Vincent Chin? Not enough people in this room, frankly, have seen Who Killed Vincent Chin. and I encourage you to find it and watch it. But there's a scene, if you recall, of Vincent's mother talking about the loss of her son, and she's shaking through the whole scene, and there's both deep, deep grief and sorrow, but rage. And I think that's how it feels to be an Asian American and to see these attacks and these deaths, and to feel like you have a target on your back.
You mentioned legal standards, and I know, or I think I know, that in Connecticut, as I understand it, your office doesn't oversee the prosecutors, the state prosecutors. Is that right?
We don't, except I have now, thankfully, the legislature and the governor have given me civil rights authority. And so we're building up our civil rights unit so that we can enforce the state's hate crimes laws through civil process.
But you mentioned legal standards. Are hate crimes, hate crime laws, are they tough to prove?
Yes.
Is the legal standard so high that they're tough to bring and then tough to win?
They're really tough to prove, not only because, for a criminal prosecution, you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's a high standard, and there's a reason for that, right? It's an important standard, and if your liberty was at stake, you would want it to be beyond a reasonable doubt as well. So that's a high standard anyway. But the trouble with hate crimes laws and prosecutions is that you have to prove a high level of intent. And the statutes in Connecticut and elsewhere tend to include terms and concepts like bias and intimidation. And those are not easy concepts to define and to apply to facts. And so, yeah, from any perspective, from any legal perspective, those are tough claims to make and to prove.
You say you're beefing up your civil rights division in the office. So how do you envision that working? How would you go after hate crimes against Asian Americans?
So, because they're not criminal prosecutions, the standard can be lower depending on the claim. And, hate doesn't just manifest itself in a shooting in Allen, Texas, right? Or an attack on Bilibir Singh in Mesa, Arizona. Hate percolates and foments and develops in so many different ways. For example, in workplace discrimination, right? Or in discrimination against customers. That sort of broad-based hate, where it's okay to discriminate against somebody, to treat them differently because of who they are or where they come from, when it's enabled and empowered by our most senior and powerful elected officials in this country. When you give voice to that anywhere, that leads to people thinking, well, it's okay if I take another step and hurt somebody or kill somebody.
We're talking about the legal side of this, the government side.
Yeah.
There was also the question of part of the cultural aspect. How much of this can be done with legislation, can be done with law enforcement, and how much of it is just a societal issue?
So a lot of it's about culture and society, which is why in Connecticut, one of our strategies has been to focus on teaching the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in a state where there aren't a ton of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders compared to my good friend Rob Bonta and former California Comptroller Betty Yee here. They're used to seeing a lot of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. But in Connecticut, we thought it was so important and our community is growing so fast that we now mandate the teaching of Asian American and Pacific Islander history in Connecticut schools so that people begin to understand our history, and they begin to see us, because I think everybody in this room knows that and feels viscerally that to be Asian American in this country largely means that you're invisible. And I made the argument, which I believe to be very true, that the reason why 6 women were targeted in Georgia and murdered is because the perpetrator thought nobody would care, because nobody sees them. And if you don't see them, you don't understand them, then you don't see them as human beings. And if you don't know the history, what really frustrates me, and I don't know if others feel this way, when Georgia happened, people would come up to me and they would say, "Oh, Mr. Attorney General, I'm so sorry. I can't believe that this happened." And I would say, why can't you believe it? Unless you don't know the history of Vincent Chin and the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Indian technology workers in Olathe, Kansas, or Japanese internment. So many people, especially people under 30, don't know about Japanese internment. They just don't know. They don't know that this country incarcerated 125,000 American citizens of Japanese descent in concentration camps on American soil. And if you don't know that history, then you can't believe it. But we can all believe it because we have seen this movie before.
You talk about visibility. You and Mr. Bonta are one of 3 Asian Americans who are attorneys general in the United States. Does that, I mean, do you feel a special responsibility because of that? Does that affect your work?
Yes, absolutely. And I have a responsibility to speak up in big ways and, using my platform and in small spaces too. So after Georgia, I put together a national convening of attorneys general. Some of the folks here participated in this national convening. We had it in Washington, and we brought in experts around hate, online hate, for example, and how it develops and turns into violence. We talked about the history of hate against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that convening, that conference, which was broadcast across the country and streamed, would not have happened if there wasn't an Asian American Attorney General in office with the resources and the community of attorneys general to come together. I want to share another quick story. I was in San Diego at one of my first AG meetings, and we were going to the border during the Trump presidency to see the humanitarian and immigrant crisis up close. And at the same time, we received a briefing from a national civil rights lawyer, very senior, recognized, respected civil rights leader. And in an AG-only meeting, there were about 18 of us, so it was only attorneys general and this guy. He did 3 hours on the history of hate and racism and discrimination and the civil rights movement, which was great. It was like a great survey. When it was over, he had to run to catch a plane. So he got in the elevator and I ran after him. And I said, "Hey, do you have a second?" He said, "Yeah, sure. What would you like, Mr. Attorney General?" Right? He was very respectful. And I said, "That was a great 3-hour survey of the history of hate in this country." He said, "Thank you." I said, "Except for 3 hours, you didn't mention once Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders." And he looked at me, he's like, "Oh shit." But right, that's not the first time. And I had to educate him that you didn't even see me. I was sitting there in the front row. You didn't even see me, and make the connection that we are part of that history too. And that we suffer and fight every single day. And to be Asian American and a Pacific Islander in this country means that we are routinely left out of that conversation. And it's our job to stand up and say, hold on a second, right? Our history is part of that too, and you must include that history, or else people are gonna get hurt, at the end of the day.
I want to get to questions, but before I do, especially given after this news out of Dallas, a lot of members of our community are going to feel anxious, they're going to feel vulnerable, they're going to feel worried. What's your message to them?
I don't blame them. And I think that I hate, in Connecticut, we say that we're tired of thoughts and prayers around gun violence. But I'm also tired of saying this is a wake-up call, right? We're well past the alarm going off. But I think in your individual communities, you need to figure out strategies to to educate people. And that includes kids in school, that includes elected officials, that includes prosecutors, that includes legislators. Whatever strategy you adopt, we went the curriculum route in part to teach AAPI history. Whatever you adopt, whatever you do is a good strategy. You just have to do something. And I think cumulatively, if we push on curriculum, if we push on hate crimes prosecutions, if we collect data about people in our community, if we educate people in our community about the threat to them and their families, if you do all of those things, I think we can move the needle.
Excuse me, there's a great shuffling of papers
No,
here.
not at all.
Because I think we're going to, as I understand it now, we're going to wait until the end of everything to do Q&A. So let me at this time bring on the rest of our panel. Amrit Kaur Akri is Legal Director of the Sikh Coalition. Aarti Kohli of the Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. Manjush Kulkarni of the AAPI Equity Alliance. And Gloria Pan of Moms Rising. I'd like to start by asking you to talk about what your organizations are doing, what efforts you are making in this area. And Manju, I think that your organization is sort of the broadest umbrella of what you're doing. So why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, John. Good evening. Good morning, everyone. And it's just such an honor to be part of this panel. I want to thank APAICS for inviting me to participate. So in March of 2020, my organization, AAPI Equity Alliance, co-founded Stop AAPI Hate with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University. And we found that within just a few weeks, we received several hundred incident reports from all across the country of anti-Asian hate incidents from community members. All of these direct reports. And since that time, that number now has grown to 11,000. And unfortunately, they come from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And the key takeaways of our data are they impact all of our communities. That includes East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, and even Pacific Islanders. They happen in public spaces, and so that includes businesses, parks, streets, schools. And then what we know is that the vast majority are not crimes. So they are not hate crimes. So if there's one message that I want to get across today, it is that most of these are some type of civil rights violation. And I want to just share that just last Wednesday, we released our civil rights report called Righting Wrongs, which looks at the fact that we did a survey with the University of Chicago and found that nearly 50% of our community members have experienced hate. And so what I want to say is that it's important, the policy work that all of us here are doing in that realm. And specifically, we had 2 bills in the California legislature that passed to address hate in public transit and in retail. And now we are looking at more federal options as well as state options, John.
Let's see, Aarti, I know that you worked with in the aftermath of the Half Moon Bay shooting. You worked very closely with the community. Talk about your work and also what message you might be sending to the Collins County, Texas community, the Allen, Texas community, who've just had this experience.
Well, my heart just goes out to every community that's grappling with this, and unfortunately, there's more and more communities every day. So I'm with Asian Law Caucus, and we are the first Pan-Asian legal civil rights organization in the country. We're 50 years old now. We did the Korematsu Quorum Nobis, just for context. So when Half Moon Bay happened, and it's only 45 minutes from San Francisco, I was immediately concerned because I had heard that there were Chinese farm workers who were killed, but I couldn't find anybody who had worked with the Chinese farm worker community or even knew that there were Chinese farm workers in Half Moon Bay. So we immediately gathered in San Francisco a lot of local nonprofits and went into or tried to contact people locally. And one of the things I will say is in the aftermath of a violent event, it's always chaos. It's always chaos, and local people are often struggling to just do basic response. And it's very hard if you're not in the local community to actually have any access. So one of the immediate responses from local folks was, we are taking care of our own. And it's a very delicate balance if you're not in the community to actually say, hey, we actually want to help you. We know that you are taking care of folks, but we also know that you don't have language or cultural competency. You don't have that on the ground. So how do we come in as partners? We don't want to call you out or say that you're trying your best, but you actually need us. So we went in and we did that as sensitively as we could, and everybody actually needs to know this. It's whether you're in government, whether you're in the private sector, in the corporate sector, you cannot just roll in and say you're going to take care of things. You're not from there. You have to have partnerships with people on the ground and build some trust and understand the local politics that you're walking into, because there always is. So one of the key things that I would also say, in addition to what Manju is saying, where not everything is crime, not everything is hate. And we have to be really careful about labeling everything as anti-Asian hate. There is a lot of violence in our communities. A lot of communities are dealing with violence. And so we have to be careful about making it just about us and making it just about anti-Asian hate. So that's one piece that I just think we have to be really, get more information before we come to a conclusion about what is happening, what has happened.
Amrith, it was talking about sort of understanding and cultural understanding in terms of the community, but you represent a community that I think there is huge misunderstanding, huge lack of understanding when they see a sick man. Something happens in someone's head that's totally not true. How do you handle that?
Right. First, thank you to APAICS for having me. I really appreciate being on this panel with all of you. So I am the legal director for the Sikh Coalition, and we are the nation's largest civil rights organization focused on working with the Sikh American community. But one of the things that we also focus on is ensuring the high impact of the cases that we take on, which means our client might be a Sikh American who's been discriminated against in the areas of hate crimes, school discrimination or bullying, employment discrimination, or a host of other racial, religious discrimination cases. But the impact of their case and the outcome of that should have a much far-reaching, broader impact that is essentially helping other racial and religious minority communities as well. And in terms of what we do to combat it, it's, really it's about us focusing on both the reactive and the proactive approach. So our legal team takes the cases and in response to something terrible that's already happened. And the rest of our program areas, our community development team, our advocacy and policy team, our education team, and so on, they're working on proactive skills and resources that we can use to help legislators understand the challenges and discrimination that our community faces, so that people in the community can learn to advocate for themselves. So schools are creating culturally competent curriculum standards. So, we're always sort of working towards all of that. And I will just echo what Aarti said in terms of rushing to call things hate, because one thing we've learned over the course of the 22 years that our organization has been here, and over the decades of bias and hate, violence and discrimination that the Sikh community, as just one community, has dealt with, is that bias comes in so many different forms. It's not just hate. There are people that have learned biases, implicit bias through our federal regulations, our government policies, workplace biases, jokes, stigmas, stereotypes. It comes in all of these forms that, especially recently, have been escalating to hate violence. But it really starts in these microaggressions of bias that are happening in our everyday lives.
And Gloria, you obviously working on the gun safety aspect of this. Talk about how this comes together with the sort of that. I mean, that's a bigger issue. Your issue, bigger than just the Asian American community.
Yes, thank you, APAICS, for having me here, and I'm very honored to be here with all of you. Moms Rising is a national, on-the-ground and online organization of more than 1 million moms and family members. We're not specifically Asian American, but we include Asian Americans. We stepped into the fight against gun violence right after Sandy Hook. So I was generally organizing in this space over the last 10 years until the Atlanta shooting happened. And at that time, it became very personal. And my partner in crime, Paul Murray, who is the chair of the Newtown Action Alliance, we looked at each other and we were like, there's nobody defending our communities from gun violence. So we started organizing. And we've learned a lot since then over the last 2 years. So first of all, we've realized that Asian Americans, all people of color, and other marginalized communities do not really have a voice in the public discussion around gun violence, and we are working actively to bring that voice to the discussion, to bring our viewpoints, and we really believe that the whole gun violence discussion needs to be about civil rights. More immediately, last year, we held the first convening of the AAPI Coalition Against Gun Violence, and we are having a second meeting this spring, this June 20th and 21st, here in Washington, D.C., and we invite everyone to join us. It's really, really important for us as a community to come together to learn about this issue, to speak out about this issue, because I'm sorry to say it's only going to get worse.
You all have a great opportunity here. You've got 2 attorneys general here, California and Connecticut. Do you feel you're getting enough support and enough work from government partners? Amber, why don't we start with you? Because I know you do a lot of work with the public sector.
We do a lot of work with the public sector. I will start by saying, organizationally, we take 0 government money, and that's because we sue the government so much.
All right, I'm out of here.
We take their money and sue them anyway.
I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of who's willing to partner with us and who isn't really interested in the issues that we're bringing up. Now, like I said, even if our individual clients are people who have been discriminated against based on their Sikh religious identity, the cases are really about the broader racial and religious minority communities. And so when we approach legislators or government officials, that's the way that we're approaching it. We're talking about how our client is sort of the messenger, but this is a much broader issue. We talk about the data and the stats on how fast growing the Asian American communities and these racially and religious minority communities are growing in their jurisdictions. We talk about the way these policies are not being interpreted properly throughout the COVID pandemic, and now, because I heard that as of May 11th, the pandemic is over. So we're realizing that there are a number of government policies at the state and federal levels that didn't take non-majority racial groups into consideration. For example, personal protective equipment, PPE. People with facial hair can't wear generally found PPE. right? That's a huge problem for the Sikh community, for the Muslim community, for the Jewish community, for other religious communities who maintain hair for religious purposes. Leaves them out of access to employment. And then there's a host of other policies across the spectrum that we're constantly dealing with. But I will say that we never give up. We are always reaching out we reach out to attorneys generals, we reach out to the governor's offices, lawmakers, and we'll reach out to individual committees. And we just have to figure out a way to align our values with the officials that we're trying to connect with, so they understand why we are bringing this to them, and they are moved to move forward and do something about it.
And Gloria, you talked about in our conversations earlier about the Hate Crimes Act that passed so quickly last year after was it the Atlanta murders? Yes. But you also say that's a double-edged sword.
It is a double-edged sword. So Mitch McConnell's wife is Asian American, and I think that they played into the model minority myth, and so they were very willing to pass that bill because it's about the Asian American community. But we have to recognize that hate crimes impact all communities of color, and in fact, and marginalized communities. And over COVID, I think the community that experienced the highest rates of hate crimes is probably the Jewish community, right? And the Black community. So we recognize, we're grateful that it passed, but we also recognize that it's because of our privilege that it was able to pass, but we do hope that it benefits all marginalized communities.
And Manju, I know that you do a lot of work, or you talked earlier about the sort of the gross inequity in terms of public resources.
Yeah, one thing that, you mentioned California and our Attorney General. We've been very successful, I think, as an advocacy community in getting the resources we need through the AAPI equity budget. $166 million is now allocated to our communities, and we've been able to use those funds for local programming, to fund community-based organizations to do the work on the ground in culturally competent and linguistically competent ways. And I think it's so important. Our communities have been underserved and under-resourced for decades by corporations, by government, by funders, from philanthropy. And so this is an opportunity, I think, to regain those funds and really hold institutions accountable, right? Because that's part of what the solution is overall, is to ensure that government addresses the needs of our community. And too often when we look to DC, that's not happening. And it's even more important now because we are seeing the resurgence of things like the alien land laws. So when you ask John, how are states doing? Some states are doing very well, and other states like Texas, Georgia, Virginia, Montana, this is spreading like wildfire. And I think people should be really alerted to the fact that these alien land laws are going to prevent our immigrant communities from purchasing property, gaining wealth, from really integrating into our society. And so that's why I think that government accountability piece and the resourcing is so important.
Yeah, well, I would just say a couple things. One, in terms of government engagement and accountability, it makes all the difference to have API people, leaders within those institutions. If you have people who understand our communities, come from those communities, it's an altogether different response. And on the bench, same. And you see it, you can actually, like, case by case, you can actually see the different response, like, for example, in California, where the head of our budget committee in the legislature that passed this $166 million bill was a former executive director of Asian Law Caucus. So, that made a difference. And I just recently talked to an attorney in Ohio, You've got Asian American communities moving there, immigrant communities moving there, and the entire judicial system, from lawyers to judges, have no cultural competency. And there's so few Asian Americans in that system. You've got harm coming to clients as a result of the lack of representation. The other thing I would say, just to switch tacks a little bit, one thing I really want to point out about our current criminal legal system is that victims do not understand that district attorneys don't represent them. They represent the state. They do not represent the victims. For victims, this is very, very hard to understand. And there's a complete lack of systems navigation. What is a pretrial hearing? I don't know. Whether I speak English or not, it's very confusing what's happening. Plus, the path to whatever justice that I may or may not get is very long, 2-3 years down the line. And so the current system is really inadequate to actually meet people where they're at and where they're hurting. And so I think we really have to rethink and broaden our frame of, for example, if it's not rising to the level of crime, then what? The police wash their hands of it, the DAs wash their hands of it. Our communities are hurting. And I'm not suggesting that we create more criminal laws. I'm suggesting that we think about, how do we talk to our communities? How do we create forums for them to support each other? How do we have a more holistic approach? And the other piece is, it's not just, a lot of what they need is beyond just retribution. They need access to decent housing. They need access to mental health support. All these other pieces that we also have to advocate for.
We have not much time left, but I do want to get questions. Sir.
My name is Joshua Shin. As a Korean American, I hope that education about our history in the United States includes the LA riots and the defense of small businesses against people who would loot, burn our property when the government failed to show up. I'm happy to hear a lot of skepticism of the government, considering the history of how often it has failed the Asian American community, whether it be the Chinese Exclusion Act, whether it be the FDR's Japanese internment, the failure of law enforcement, et cetera. And I think you're seeing a backlash in cities like New York, San Francisco, where people are demanding more criminal justice, stronger criminal justice, because they can't find the stability in their lives. This is also partially a reason why Asian American gun ownership is the highest it has ever been, because these last 3 years have been filled with uncertainty, doubt, and stability for the economically aspirant, right? I think that people in this room forget that what we share is not our background, but the fact that we are all college educated. And that there are people who are still looking to rise, looking to meet and achieve the American dream, that are looking to, whether it be our criminal justice system, whether it be officials, nonprofits, to provide that stability. So I guess, like, what can we do to, make life more stable and predictable for the people who have just arrived, who are not as privileged as we are with our educations, and how can we protect them from community hate? Thank you.
I just want to quickly say that the issue of safety is very real. We're feeling really, really unsafe, and studies have shown that actually Asian Americans are feeling that more acutely than other communities. But my message is, do not buy a gun. Okay? Do not buy a gun. It's because we have so many guns in our system that we have so much gun violence. Asian Americans have historically experienced the lowest rates of gun violence because we've had the lowest rates of guns. We need to resist the siren call of gun culture. The incidents of actually defending yourself from a gun are really, really low. But the incidences of accidental gun death, suicide by gun, and all the other ways of dying by gun violence is actually very high. Please do not buy guns.
I'm saying, my point is that people will be, it's easy to say here at a panel in Washington, D.C. It's not as easy to say when you are a small business owner in Koreatown, in New York City, in these cities where that people are seeing homeless people camping on their storefronts. There are people that are seeing more danger on the streets and lower traffic, foot traffic, right? I'm not saying that guns are ideal, but what alternatives can people on the panel provide that would, instead of just saying, please don't buy them?
There seems to be a lot of frustration with government, and as the sole government representative up here, I'm going to do to you what it's done to me when I'm the only Asian on a panel, to speak for my entire community. What response, what would you tell this gentleman?
So I can only say two things. Number one is maybe everybody in this room has a college degree, but not everybody in our community has a college degree. And a lot of folks, especially recent immigrants, like my parents 50 years ago, come here with nothing, and they don't have education, they don't have access to housing, they don't have access to jobs. And in this day and age, as immigrants, they are treated like criminals sometimes, particularly if their immigration status isn't entirely in order. And all of that hate is cumulative. What I can say to you is, I wasn't going to bring this up, but my parents were small business owners. They ran a Chinese restaurant, then they ran a convenience store. My mother was nearly murdered in our store, okay? And she was stabbed to within inches of her life. The week I was going to take the Connecticut bar exam. Our family knows that pain better than anybody. But I know in the fullness of time that that incident, that hatred, I'm going to call it what it is, that violence didn't just happen in that moment, and it wasn't just a public safety question, and it wasn't a question of whether she was armed or not, okay? It was cumulative. And though not everything meets the criminal definition or legal standard of hate, bias, intimidation, right? When we have initiatives to disenfranchise people through these alien land laws, when I'm called the Manchurian AG and routinely accused of being an agent for the Chinese Communist Party, when I'm an American, Jack, right? I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. Even when we talk about TikTok and acknowledging the national security issues, there's a heavy dose of racism in that conversation. We have to call it out, and all of that makes us unsafe. It's cumulative. And that's how I think many people see it.
Manju, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was just going to say, we are in Los Angeles. So we know we have been working in Los Angeles since 1975. And what I will tell you is the organizations that work in Koreatown know and understand the problems that you're talking about. But I think by working with other communities of color, we get the solutions that we need. I think we need to acknowledge the anti-blackness in our community and fight it rather than acceding to it. And I think your point about government accountability is important, and that's by working together. And right now, I'm really proud to say that we are in cross-racial coalitions with African American and Latinx groups to have more power in Los Angeles, to get independent redistricting commissions, more city council members. All of that is going to get the solutions that you're seeking, and not gun purchasing, and not, I think, just pointing fingers at other communities of color.
Is there another quick question? I'm getting frantic hand signals that we got to wrap up here, but sir.
This question is for the Attorney General. First of all, thank you so much for, I'm not trying to target you, but you are a leader when it comes to abortion rights among women in general. But among the Asian American community, especially those who have very deep religious convictions, especially in the Filipino community, for example, in terms of the Catholic faith, do you see a lot of resistance coming up, or some kind of either, not necessarily ignorance, but not necessarily strong emotional attachment to the issue that you're trying to protect among women in general?
To be candid, no. I haven't seen a lot of resistance, even among people who are faithful and regularly practice their faith, because I do think that people in our community, women in particular, see this as a matter of their own liberty and choice and bodily autonomy, and they know better than anybody why they came here in the first place, which was to be free from control and intimidation and to have the liberty to live the life that you seek to pursue for yourself and for your families. And so, no, I haven't. I've seen a lot of immigrant and AAPI women say, you know, this is my life, my body, and my choice, and I should have these fundamental rights.
With that, I think that's got to be the last word, because we are getting, we've got to clear the stage for the next event. So thank you all for listening. Thank you all to the panel, and enjoy the rest of the conference.